The prophecy of Isaiah. This is the 6th presentation in this series, where we're going to be asking the question, who can we trust? Let's just reflect back quickly to the previous presentations. In the first 5 chapters of the book, Isaiah has outlined the key messages he's giving to the people of Judah, and he's done it faithfully. Then 2 disturbing events happen one after the other. Within a few years, a new Assyrian ruler starts to threaten. And then good King Uzziah, who'd reigned for a long time, dies. So the kind of stability of the situation was disturbed. And Isaiah had come face to face with the presence of God in the temple of Jerusalem. And his commission was extended and clarified. When he came face to face with God Almighty, enthroned in majesty and glory, he immediately felt inadequate. He knew he wasn't good enough. He'd failed. He'd rebelled. But God, through the seraphim, provides the means of cleaning him up. Isaiah realized that he needed to change, but he couldn't do it. That's what we call repentance. Very positive. We want something better. But God knows we can't, and he does it for us. We don't deserve it. We don't win it. He gives it to us. That's grace. And grace meets repentance. And for Isaiah, grace met repentance in the temple confrontation. You see, Isaiah had the message right. He'd understood the situation. He was hearing God correctly. But he had to come much closer to God. He had to move to a far deeper level in his understanding of the Lord of the universe. And chapter 6 brings him to this point and equips him to move forward to the next stages in declaring the mind of God to this people. He has to go on declaring it. That's his task. But in general, most would choose not to listen. And he's warned about that. And as a result, most would miss out on all that God could do in their lives. That is so sad. But how often it happens. And the book uses a lovely phrase. And turn and be healed. We have got to be willing to turn. We've got to be willing to look for something better, recognizing our failures, our falling short. Then God can come and touch and heal and restore. That involves our active response. We can't sit around waiting for God to act. We have got to respond. We decide we want something better, but God enables the better to come for us. That's always God's way. It runs right throughout the whole of the biblical account, and it's true to life. We decide. God enables. With that background, let's move on into chapter 7. Here's a reminder of the map, with Judah shown in the orange-brown colour, with Jerusalem its capital city, Damascus the capital city of Syria, quite different from Assyria, which was the empire. Syria, a small nation-state. Samaria, the capital of Israel, which had broken away from Judah, God's people divided. And to the south, Philistia and Edom. But the problem was that Judah, being so small, was being hemmed in. Syria and Israel, Syria sometimes called Aram in the Bible, they'd come together thinking they could get the best pickings of Judah. Philistia was continuing to nibble away from the edge, and Edom was opportunistic, taking every opportunity to grab what it could get. And Syria was being got at from all 4 directions. But that wasn't the real problem, because behind it all was Assyria, which was much further north, much more powerful. And now they had a new and powerful ruler, Tiglath-Pileser III, who consolidated position and had aims and designs to take over the whole area right down to Egypt. It was not a good position to be in. Now we're going to look at the broad stretch there. It's quite a long bit. You'll find some of the historical background in 2 Kings 16 and 2 Chronicles 28. Let me just summarize this to you for a while. King Ahaz had come to the throne. Now you've got to watch the dates. In the way that Israel and Judah worked, kings and their sons often ruled together. So the dates are sometimes a little misleading, because quite often you had a king, but the son actually did the work. So there was quite often two kings running in parallel. But that's his approximate dates. And he'd undermined the worship of God. He'd brought in false worship. Pagan worship centres had been set up, and this involved temple prostitution and child sacrifice. Indeed, it's recorded he was involved in child sacrifice himself. And Israel and Syria had come together in a kind of confederation, while at the same time there were attacks from the south. In that situation, Ahaz, along with a son, goes to meet King Ahaz. Now the year is about 735, maybe plus or minus 1. And Isaiah makes it absolutely clear. The glory days of Syria and Israel were over. They're not the threat. He describes them as like smouldering sticks left at the end of a bonfire. They're finished. He points out that within 65 years, Israel, called Ephraim in the text, it'll be shattered. And in fact, in 670 BC, King Esarhaddon from Assyria imported settlers into the area of Israel, and the nation was indeed shattered. It all came true, as Isaiah said. So he comes and brings that message of warning and guidance to the king Ahaz. But Ahaz didn't listen. And very foolishly, he appealed to the emperor Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria for help. He forms a bargain with him against Israel and Syria, who aren't really a threat. But he has to pay for it. And part of the bargain was he brought Assyrian religion into the land. And Assyrian religion was particularly barbaric and evil, and very cruel on people. And the Temple of Jerusalem was modified, and then it was shut down. Now, false religion isn't just a false belief system. It brings in practices that are thoroughly evil, like, for example, temple prostitution and child sacrifice and all kinds of things like that destroy lives. So Ahaz didn't listen, and that's what he did. Isaiah challenges him. If you don't stand firm, if you don't trust God, if you don't listen to what he's saying, you won't survive. The nation won't survive. Because true security comes from God. Ahaz was trying to get his security by making negotiations with Tiglath-Pileser, and you couldn't trust him an inch. And the land was stripped of its wealth, and false religion was brought in, destroying the social structure of the land. Ahaz saw things from the human perspective. He thought Israel and Syria were the major threat, but Isaiah saw it from the divine perspective. Remember, a prophet sees things from the mind of God. And Isaiah realized the real threat is Assyria. The others are just passing issues. If we look at the struggles that we have today, we've got to look and see what really is happening, which means we need God's divine perspective. We need the prophets of today. Isaiah brings a real challenge. He challenges Ahaz. Well, test God out over this. See if it's true. Ask anything you like. And Ahaz refuses. In the process, he misrepresents God if we look back at the context of what he says. And then Isaiah gives an amazing reply, which has often been ripped out of context, but I want to look at it in context. Hear now, you house of David, that's the descendants of King David, of whom Ahaz was one. Is it not enough to try the patience of humans? Will you try the patience of my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He'll eat curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the Lord knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the two kings you dread will be laid waste. The Lord will bring on you and on your people and on the house of your father a time unlike any since Ephraim broke away from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. A son would be born, and before he was weaned and eating solid food and had any idea of what was right and wrong, the land would be ravaged. There's the sign. We rip that out of context, but let's look at its original meaning before we look at how it's used in the New Testament. Perhaps about age 2. Before he is that age, the land of the two kings, that's Israel and Syria, will be laid waste, and their threat will have gone. And a warning for Ahaz and the people of Judah, that the king of Assyria will come and will cause them horrendous problems. And all of that came to be true. Let's look at that verse. The real problem is not Israel and Syria in some sort of confederation. They'll be wiped out. The real problem is Assyria, growing in power, destructive power, evil power, and they're going to sweep over and cause problems. Now you look at that and you read it quickly and you forget it. The Lord will bring on you. It suggests that God is bringing disasters on people. It's a Hebrew way of saying that God was in ultimate control. The people of Judah, particularly from the royal line and the priestly line, the leaders of the nation, they had turned away from God and they'd moved the nation away from God's protection. Now this is the Hebrew way of saying that. It's not that God is using evil. The people have moved out from God's protection and chosen their own way, rejected God's direction, and they had rejected God's protection. As a result, they would suffer. And then there's a stretch which pictures what this would mean. And Isaiah paints a vivid picture of what this destruction from Assyria is going to do. Because Isaiah ignored the prophet's warnings. He knew better than the man of God. And he made a pact with the enemy, Assyria. Never a good thing to make a pact with the enemy. In the process, he undermined God's place in the nation, and the people are being moved out of the protection of God's power. And the land was overrun repeatedly by the Assyrians. History shows that happened. The land becomes depopulated as a result. History shows that happens. And the land, over the time, began to revert to a wilderness. People had been wiped out, crops destroyed, farmland messed up, repeatedly. God's protection was no longer there. because of the decisions of the leadership of the people. How sad. But Isaiah saw it. Now let's come back to this. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel, quoted in Matthew's Gospel. Now the first thing to note is that in the original language, the word for virgin there is a young woman of marriageable age, presumed to be a virgin. There is in Hebrew another word which focuses on the virginity. So this is just a young woman coming into marriage who happens to be a virgin. Emmanuel, as is explained in the text, means God with us. God's presence is still with us. Now remember the significance of that. Ahaz and the leadership of the people had moved the nation away from God, outside God's protection. Isaiah is saying a young woman coming into marriage, a virgin, will give birth to a son. And the symbolism is, when this happens, it's a reminder God has not left the nation completely. The leadership have rejected God. God's protection is gone, but God has not let them go completely. It's a sign of hope. And before the child is weaned, Syria and Israel will be defeated. Perhaps Isaiah's intention was that when these events happened, the penny would drop with Ahaz and he'd put his house in order. It didn't happen. Now we've got to see that the word Emmanuel and the idea of God with us occurs 3 times in chapters 7 and 8. And if we rip this verse out of context and ignore the other 2 times, then we're not getting a complete picture. So let's come back to that in a moment or two. It's in chapter 8, the other 2 times. So let's look at that and see how the thing fits together and see what Isaiah was meaning. Beginning of chapter 8, the Lord said to me, take a large scroll and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maharshal al-Hashbaz. So I called in Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Jeberechiah as reliable witnesses for me. Now that word there, Maharshal al-Hashbaz, means quick to plunder, swift to spoil. But he gets 2 officials of the land to witness that he's written this down, and 2 witnesses counted in law. Let's go on. Then I made love to the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said to me, name him Maharshal al-Hashbaz. So he's declared this name with its meaning, which would be understood. Now, I made love to, in the original, usually speaks of the first sexual intercourse. Now, Isaiah already had a son, but of course in those days people died young, and it's quite likely that his first wife had died. So he was remarrying, and the first time he went in to his new wife, described as a prophetess, she may have been a prophet in her own right, or she may be just a title because Isaiah was the prophet. And a son came in due time. And the son was named that very long, complicated name. As a reminder to the nation, witnessed in advance, quick to plunder, swift to spoil. Goes on, for before the Lord the boy knows how to say my father or mother, that's before he's weaned, the wealth of Damascus and the plunder of Samaria will be carried off by the king of Assyria. In other words, the 2 nations that Ahaz feared would be gone. Quick to plunder, swift to spoil. And the name of the child would carry the reminder. And if you look at the history of the events, it's exactly right. Assyria attacked the 2 lands and flattened them. They were no longer any threat to anybody. Let's go on. The Lord spoke to me again, because this people has rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, and rejoices over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore the Lord is about to bring against them the mighty flood waters of the Euphrates, that's Assyria, the king of Assyria and all his pomp. It will overflow all its channels, run over all its banks, sweep on into Judah, swirling over it, passing through it, and reaching up to the neck. Its outspread wings will cover the breadth of your land. Emmanuel. This little stream just outside Jerusalem is being compared to the mighty flood of the great river Euphrates, which ran through the land of Assyria. These were the rulers of Syria. The Assyrian Empire was going to sweep south with all its powers. The people had rejected the ways of God in Judah. They'd allied themselves with Assyria. This was giving permission for Assyria to sweep south, wipe out Syria itself, wipe out Israel, and sweep on. And it was going to sweep through the land like a flood. The whole thing would backfire on Ahaz extremely badly. You don't make pacts with the enemy. But it would only be up to the neck. And it's interesting that in the great onslaught that followed under his son, the successor, the whole land was messed up. But Jerusalem survived by God's intervention. It was nearly swamped because God would still be with us. By bringing the birth of the Son from the virgin prophetess, naming him the way he was named, was the reminder that no matter what Assyria was going to do to the land, no matter how much the people deserved to be wiped out, the people of Judah, for their disobedience and rebellion, God was still with them. They would be swamped up to the neck, but they would still survive. What a beautiful and wonderful picture. A picture of hope amidst a picture of disaster. That's what happened. About 3 years later, which is about the right time for before the weaning of the child, Syria and Israel were engulfed by Assyria the empire, and then Judah itself was overrun by the Assyrians, and over time, but Jerusalem was never captured, up to the neck, because God is still with us. Isaiah pictures this: raise the war cry, you nations, and be shattered. Listen, all you distant lands, prepare for battle and be shattered. Prepare for battle and be shattered. Devise your strategy and it will be thwarted. Propose your plan, but it will not stand, for God is with us. That Assyria would sweep on, would cause all the problems, and a destructive power, an evil power, wanton cruelty and brutality they exerted on populations. But God would still be with his people. For God is with us, the same word. And the people groups around about Judah, the people of God, they were continuing to seek to destroy the people of God. But despite all Ahaz's disobedience and rebellion, the destiny of God's people is not in their hands, because God is still with his people. The people went through a terrible time and eventually went through a terrible exile. They brought it on themselves by their wanton rebellion and disobedience, moving out from God's protection. But God was still with them. A message of hope. And it's quoted by Matthew in his Gospel. Now can you see the picture? In the birth of Jesus from the Virgin Mary, Matthew saw a picture, and it reminded him of God's great intervention events in the days of Isaiah, when the son that Isaiah was given all these centuries before was a reminder that God had not left his people. Despite all the rebellion, despite all the mess they were in, God was still with them. And now in the birth of Jesus, the greatest sign of all, that God was literally with his people. He had come in human flesh to rescue humanity, starting with the people of God, to rescue humanity from our rebellion. God with us. And Matthew saw that in the model and the picture of the life of Isaiah and his son, God was acting again on a much bigger and deeper scale, because Jesus brought the fullness of God in himself into our humanity. God with us. In the days of Isaiah, the son that was born kept alive, because his name would keep reminding the people, kept alive the hope and assurance. No matter what was going to happen, no matter what disasters would come, God was still with his people. They'd moved away from his protection, but God was not going to let them down completely, up to the neck, but not destroyed, not wiped out. But the birth of Jesus brought a much greater and deeper hope, an ultimate hope and assurance. God had not left his people. God had not left humanity. God had come himself in human flesh to rescue humanity through a miraculous birth. A beautiful and wonderful picture. Let's move on. This is what the Lord says to me with his strong hand upon me, warning me not to follow the way of this people. Do not call conspiracy everything this people calls a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. He will be a holy place for both Israel and Judah. He will be a stone that causes people to stumble, and a rock that makes them fall. And for the people of Jerusalem, he will be a trap and a snare. Many of them will stumble. They will fall and be broken. They will be snared and captured. Bind up this testimony of warning and seal up God's instructions among my disciples. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the descendants of Jacob. I will put my trust in him. God is speaking to Isaiah, and Isaiah is sharing this with his group of followers called his disciples. Let's look at this a little further. That phrase there speaks of a very powerful spiritual experience. And in life we sometimes have these momentous experiences when we're so conscious of God's presence. Sometimes it stops us even moving physically. Sometimes it's deeply emotional and powerful and overwhelming. Sometimes we fall on our face before God in tears. God's strong hand was upon Isaiah. Now you can't tell from the English, but in the original, this is plural. So Isaiah is addressing the group of his disciples. This is not just addressed to Isaiah singular. It's not do you not call. It's you plural. So this is for the group. And the group would continue on. You see, we've got a choice. And God had shown Isaiah, which he then showed to his followers. You can either put God at the center of events because he makes sense of life. If we know how God sees it, we see life from his perspective, things start to fit into place and we can see how to go and what to do. But if we push God to the edge like Ahaz had done, God becomes a kind of stumbling block. Seems to cause us confusion. Now that's a very, very deep thought. And if you look at our society in the West today, you can see this precisely happening. There are minorities within God's people who are seeing God at the center and are making sense of the way our societies are going by seeing it from God's perspective. But in our societies today, the majorities don't understand what's happening. We're lost and confused about the way ahead. We don't know how to deal with the problems that are coming to the Western world today. We're reacting badly and foolishly. And sometimes we blame God and say, why does he bring this upon us? He's become a stumbling block. And Isaiah grasped that that would always be true. That when we don't allow God to make sense of the practicalities of life and start to look to Him to see things from His perspective, then it's as if God becomes a kind of stumbling block and we start to blame Him. We don't understand what's going on. How can God allow this? You hear these phrases all the time today. And what Isaiah is told to do here to his disciples, just commit this to God's direction. Trust Him. Step by step it'll make sense. Step by step you'll know what to do. Two ways to go. One of the ways that tragically we're not allowing to happen in large tracts of the people of God in the churches throughout the West today. We've confined God to religious buildings called churches. We've confined Him to these buildings, and we've reduced our religion to formalities and rituals and performance. And God is no longer interacting with us in the practicalities of everyday living, and I mean everyday living. That's how Isaiah saw it. God is interested in the details of you, the practical details of your life. That allows us to make sense of things. It allows us to cope. It doesn't instantly solve every problem. Life throws things at us that are very unfair at times. But we have to bring God into the center of our thinking, in the practicalities. But what we've done so often, and it's before our eyes in the West today, is that. And it was happening in the days of King Ahaz. And then God becomes that. And people start to blame God for the problems. Why does He allow? Why does He not intervene? And we keep being tripped up by the whole thing. Let's go on. Here am I, and the children God has given me. That's Isaiah speaking. We are signs and symbols in Israel from the Lord Almighty who dwells in Mount Zion. The names the sons were given were a reminder, a symbol. The coming of the child was a reminder and a symbol of what God was doing. By contrast, when someone tells you to consult the mediums and spiritists, whisper and mutter, should not a people inquire of their God? Why consult the dead on behalf of the living? Consult God's instruction and testimony, the testimony of warning. If anyone does not speak according to this word, they have no light of dawn. Distressed and hungry, they will roam through the land. When they are famished, they will become enraged, and looking upwards will curse their king and their God. Then they will look towards the earth and see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. Probably he's still speaking to his group of disciples. Nevertheless, there'll be no more gloom for those, that's literally her, which means the land, who are in distress. In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. Again, a verse that's ripped out of context, but it makes so much more sense in the New Testament when we see its context. That was what was happening in the days of Isaiah and the days of Ahaz the king. By deliberate choice, Ahaz was leading the nation to be a society that was rejecting God's landmarks. They'd moved away from God's protection, God's direction. He wasn't listening to Isaiah or anyone else that spoke from God. But when a people does that, we humans are made to be spiritual. We're made to respond to God. And when we push God out to the edge of our life and we reduce our religion to performance and ritual, we look for a spiritual basis of living somewhere else. It's built into us. And that's what happens. Happened in the days of Isaiah, and it's recorded. And you can see it in the West today. And those who studied this I've noted that when a society turns away from God, then what we loosely call spiritualism and the occult, they start to increase. It's happening before our eyes. And that's what is the outcome. Now, if we just stop and reflect on Western society at the moment, the political and social turmoil, the mess that our media is in, we don't see light at the end of a dark tunnel. We don't know the way to go. Doesn't make sense. That describes Western society beautifully. And sadly. And that's where it leads. Every problem, every disaster, every setback, immediately our media and our political masters build in a blame culture, and we go along with it. And we look for somebody to be at fault. Someone we can point the finger at. We won't take our responsibility. And that characterizes so much of Western life today. Covered up, yes, because the rich are getting richer. And they control so much, we don't always see that. And we are living in a world of social confusion, ethical and moral confusion. We're not even sure what right and wrong is these days. And it goes back to when the people refused to listen to God. That is a perfect description. Isaiah's painted it in these poetic terms. It was a perfect description of what was happening. History shows it. It was happening in his day. And it's happening today. But amidst that mess, Isaiah lifts the curtain and he sees things from God's perspective. And he reveals it to his followers. The total gloom that seems to be engulfing us, yes, it's up to the neck, but it's not final. His picture is consistent. That's happened, and it's happening today. That happened. Ahaz didn't have the answers. Neither did his son Hezekiah, though he was a good king. Same today. But then Isaiah sees that the northern areas of the whole land of Israel, they were the ones who'd suffered first and worst because they were nearer Assyria. Zebulun and Naphtali were nearer the border, and they had the strongest non-Jewish influences imposed upon them from Assyria. And as they were the one who'd suffered first, they were the ones where the release would come from. God was going to allow his people to move into exile because they'd chosen to reject God. They'd chosen to move out of his protection. It was inevitable as night followed day. But, there was hope. Emmanuel, God is still with us. We're up to the neck in it, but we've not gone right under. God is still there. And the light was going to come from these northern areas. And of course we know that was fulfilled in Jesus. But there's a broad principle. The people flapped around under their leadership, looking for answers, with the attacks coming from all around the land. They didn't know what to do, but they failed to trust God, that God had an agenda, that God was working things through, that God would look after them. They moved away from God's protection. They moved away from God's resources, but they had to come to an end of themselves before they could receive God's grace. They had to go through all these experiences, indeed in exile. They brought it on themselves. But only then did the penny drop. Oh, we learn so slowly. And so many of us suffer such long periods of anguish and problems. We bring it on ourselves so often because we don't listen to God and look to see what he's saying into the situation. Their humiliation as a nation was self-inflicted. They brought it on themselves. Isaiah sees this so clearly. But God was still with them. And God would come. And when they penny dropped, and they realized through all the disasters of the overrunning, the overruling, and then the exile, the penny would drop and they would want something better. And when you want something better, you just open the door for God to give you that better. You open the door for God to act in your life and the divine provision to come, and for God to lift your head high. No longer humiliation, but exaltation. What a message for us today. And I leave that message for the West. I leave that for the people of God in the West. We've pushed God to the periphery of our lives. We've locked God up in our church buildings through ritual and performance. And we've not sought what He's saying to us in this. And we're bringing the humiliation on ourselves. But there is hope. God is still with us. We're up to the neck in it. But when we come to the end of ourselves, then that's the beginning of allowing God to come in His grace. Next part, we're going to continue that with the theme of There is Hope.